Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks I know are joining from across the globe today. I'd like to begin by doing a land acknowledgement of where I'm coming from. I am based out of the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, also known as Ottawa, Canada, Canada's capital. I'd like to thank the audience today for taking time out of what we know is a very busy time of the year, a busy next few weeks, to join us in this critical and timely discussion. Today's webinar is titled Women, Technology, and Peacemaking, 25 years after United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, and it's brought to you by the Citizen Lab and the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy based out of the University of Toronto, also here in Canada. My name is Aruj Mian. I run a boutique consultancy called She Associates, which actions women, peace, security, human rights, justice, equality, across contexts, across institutions, internally, externally, and across the globe. I will be moderating today's discussion for you. So to get us started, many of us already know that digital repression is a modern security threat. And indeed, as we will learn and confirm today, a modern threat to women's peace movements globally. I hope today is inspiring for you. I hope it nudges more of us to recognize the fight, the plight, and the courage of those who are rising for humanity with real risks to their lives across the globe. And I hope, and please note, if you have one takeaway today, it is a commitment to strengthen our collective solidarity for tangibly supporting these unrelenting and brave warriors. This is an important few weeks and year and very noteworthy. Today marks day 2 of the international campaign, which many of you know is dear to my work and my heart, the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And fittingly enough, we see this year's theme platformed, this year's theme's announcement from the UN as Unite to End Digital Violence Against All Women and Girls. We cannot ignore that digital violence against women and girls is one of the fastest growing forms of gendered violence across the world, and this campaign platforms this issue this year. We also acknowledge that this year marks the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, also known as the Global Footprint for Advancing Gender Equality. And this year also marks the 25th anniversary of the first resolution of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. Initiated by the 1325 resolution, this repertoire of 10 resolutions has spanned 25 years, recognizing the critical need for the meaningful participation of women in peace building, if we are indeed to pursue a durable peace. This agenda promulgates the 4 foundational pillars which address the impact of conflict and instability on women and girls, but also guides and confirms their critical role in prevention, resolution, and post-conflict reconstruction. The pillars of prevention, participation, protection, and relief and recovery are noteworthy as part of this agenda. But what happens if these voices that need to represent and amplify societal needs, these voices that need to demand freedoms, are sabotaged, threatened, muted, censored? What happens? In today's age of information and communications technology, digital spaces have fueled movements. They have documented live revolutions and even the most vile of atrocities. Social media has provided unprecedented platforms to amplify demands for peace, justice, and democracy, and built and united a community across borders. However, we see disturbing twists, trends, and turns. We know that safety and protection are foundational to peace and equality efforts globally. And as we will explore with our experts today, digital safety needs to be a part of this equation. Today, we will learn about the various types of online abuse women and girls and peace activists face, and how these also include intersecting forms of violence, discrimination, including gendered harassment, smear campaigns, that transcend from the digital realm to real life and transcend state borders to classify as transnational. We will learn about the real dangers of when these spaces are manipulated for harm and discuss what can be done to ensure safety and progress towards equality and peace. Today's panel participation spans continents and experience, from researchers to practitioners, advocates, and experts, shedding light on a growing threat to our safety and movements. Today, you are in for a treat. We will begin with keynote opening remarks, followed by 2 engaging panel discussions with researchers and practitioners, and finish the webinar with an audience Q&A. So, without further ado, I will jump right in and say it is a distinct pleasure to be able to introduce you to Ms. Lara Scarpita. Ms. Lara is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Senior Advisor on Gender Issues and head of the Gender Issues Program in the Office of the Secretary General. She is also a senior advisor and former political advisor on peace mediation and gender at the EU delegation to the United Nations in Geneva. She will offer today's keynote remarks. Go ahead, Lara.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening on wherever you are. It's really a great pleasure to be here, to be connected here, and I really want to extend my sincere gratitude to Citizen Lab, to the Monsky Institute, but in particular to Noura Jizawi for inviting me and for organizing these extremely timely discussions. As you mentioned, yesterday we launched the annual 16 Days of Activism campaign. This year is dedicated to ending digital violence against all women and girls. So these discussions are extremely timely. But we are also marking this year and celebrating the milestone 25th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, a document which has for the first time recognized that women play a vital role in conflict prevention, in peace building, and in post-conflict rehabilitation. And I use the word celebrating intentionally, because despite the many challenges that we are facing in implementing the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and there are many, and I'm sure will be amply discussed today, I also firmly believe that UN Security Council Resolution 1325 is in many ways a success story, because in the last 25 years, the Women, Peace and Security agenda has given women a voice, has given a voice to women peace builders, to activists, to human rights advocates who didn't have it before. And all these activists and women leaders are today, despite all the many challenges that they are facing, they continue to fight for peace, for integrity, and for justice, for the benefit not only of women, but for the benefit of society as a whole. Of course, in perspective, this resolution was a milestone, but of course, the world that we live in today has significantly changed. Is very different to the world we had in 2000. And of course, one of the biggest changes is the digital revolution. You rightly mentioned in the introduction now, this digital revolution that we have seen in the last 1.5, 2 decades has really served as an incredible source of information, of dissemination, and also offered new forms of participation. But we also know, and is becoming increasingly evident, that it has also led to new unprecedented mechanisms of control, of surveillance, and also of violence. Women advocating for peace, advocating for human rights, and also for gender equality have been pushed at the forefront of this new reality. And the systemic, what we are seeing is systemic online surveillance, discriminatory campaign, dissemination of personal information without consent, and stalking are all being used to undermine women leadership. And the reality is that in the digital world today is becoming hostile for women, more and more hostile for women and girls, and is also becoming a new vehicle for violence, and too often without any accountability. I want to cite the Economist Intelligence Unit survey. There are many data available, but the Economist Intelligence Unit survey is particularly important and quite shocking figures, mentioning that 38% of women worldwide reported personal experiences with online violence, and 85% have witnessed it. This is a 2023 survey, so these figures only represent the tip of the iceberg and are certainly worse today than they were 2 years ago. We also know that the emerging technologies, indeed, like artificial intelligence, are today making matters worse. Tools that generate deepfake images are increasingly used to target women and girls, especially women and girls, and in particular, those who are in leadership positions, politicians, human rights defenders, journalists. And we also know that the digital repression has become transnational. You mentioned it a little bit at the beginning. The threats and attacks are being transferred across platforms and states. They follow activists, they follow journalists and researchers, even when they leave high risk regions. And I know because I've been speaking with many women peace builders in countries affected by conflict, and what they tell us is that they often they become, when they become prominent, they become targets of online violence, and this is because their voices and the impact that they have pose a threat to those who are striving to remain in power through force and control. So the picture that we have today is indeed quite gloomy, is quite complex. So events like this are extremely important. But I also want to say that the digital landscape, we shouldn't just focus on the negative side, because the reality is that the digital landscape is not only a risk zone, it has also become, for many women and girls, a space for resistance, a space for innovation, and a space for solidarity. We work very closely with women organizations in the OEC, and we see that women and feminist organizations today more and more utilize online platform for documenting human rights violations, for training, for supporting societies, but also for supporting each other, and also for strengthening the security and the safety nets among themselves. So looking forward and looking at it from a more positive perspective, certainly digitalization, on the one hand, it can be a threat, but on the other, it can also be a remarkable tool for promoting gender equality and for strengthening the women, peace, and security agenda. And I just want to give you some examples of this. Well, first of all, the online platforms can provide women in even the most isolated areas with access to learning, financial inclusion, and civic engagement. E-learning platforms, they break down geographical barriers, and digital services open doors to credit savings and entrepreneurship opportunities. When we're talking about empowering women politically to play an active role in the women, peace, and security agenda, they need to also be empowered economically. But also social media and communication platform also serve as a fantastic tool to amplify women's voices, women visions for peace in policy discussions, and also raise awareness about some of the key challenges and opportunities that women face. So, all in all, when harnessed responsibly and inclusively, digital tools can accelerate progress towards sustainable peace and gender equality. So, we need to look at both sides of the coin. Now, today, discussions, of course, are critical, but we also have to admit that without digital rights and without digital security, the Women, Peace and Security agenda today cannot really satisfy the demands of the modern world. Um, the protection of women in conflict zones now needs to include the protection of their data, their digital track, their freedom of expression online. The participation of women in peace building, it's also not possible without protecting them from digital violence and without granting them access to technology. So, in my view, today's event is a very important opportunity to discuss the many opportunities, but also the challenges that we face, and to chart some very concrete step forward and recommendations. We also, it's important from our perspective to create a space where women can voice their demands with confidence and with security, both online and on offline. And finally, as a final thought, I think it is also important to identify how can women integrate and can how can we all collectively work to integrate digital rights of women in all the four pillars of the Women, Peace and Security agenda: prevention, participation, protection, and relief and recovery. And of course, this also means developing gendered approaches to digital security, incorporating key aspects such as digital literacy program in the training of peace builders. This is something that we are already doing extensively at UEC, but also creating safety mechanism for women activists by working very closely with companies and tech companies to ensure that women are offered a space, but are also protected against attacks. So to conclude, the 25 years of UN Security Council 1325, it is here, but we are in November. These 25 years are already in the past. We now need to look at the next 25 years, looking at what needs to be done to ensure that the WPS agenda is fully implemented, but also how can we leverage digital tools to translate the global commitments into real actions while protecting women and their safety. Thank you very much, and I look forward to today's discussions.
Thank you so much, Lara. I think it is so important to acknowledge that there's the good and the benefits and the opportunities as well as the challenges. And I hope that we're able to chart those recommendations out today or initiate. I know even in our audience, we have a lot of experts, and I hope that this is very motivating as a conversation today. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to get started on our first panel. And you'll see on your screen the pictures of our beautiful panelists. And I'll jump right into intros and we'll get started. So first you'll see on your screen Noura Al-Jazawi. She is a senior researcher at the Citizen Lab. Her research focuses on digital authoritarianism, disinformation, and digital transnational repression, informed by her own background in human rights activism during the Syrian uprising. Ms. Al-Jazawi holds a master's degree in global affairs from the University of Toronto and has been recognized for her work in online safety and digital security. You'll also see Marcus Mikkelsen. He is a senior researcher also at the Citizen Lab, focusing on digital threats against exiles and diaspora communities. Previously, he was a senior postdoctoral researcher in the research group on law, science, technology, and society at Virgin Universiteit in Brussels. He also holds a senior information controls fellowship with the Open Technology Fund and has worked as a lecturer and postdoc researcher in the political science department of the University of Amsterdam. He holds a PhD in media and communication studies from the University of Erfurt in Germany as well. And Sienna Ansis is a senior legal advisor at the Citizen Lab. Prior to joining the lab, she worked as a litigation associate at Morrison and Foerster in New York City and clerked for the Honorable Justice Cromwell at the Supreme Court of Canada and the Court of Appeal for Ontario. Sienna holds a BA in journalism and anthropology from Concordia University, a Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of Civil Law from McGill University, and a Master of Laws from the University of Cambridge. Welcome, everybody. So I guess I'll jump right straight to the first question. This panel is going to share with us an understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about digital violence, domestic and transnational repression from a gendered lens. So I'll pass it off to Marcus, and I'll throw you the first question. Can you start off by explaining the integral importance of digital spaces in the realm of peace building, human rights, and democracy movements? What would you say classifies as a digital space, even, and why do they matter? How do they influence peace building and the realization of human rights and freedoms? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Uruj, for this introduction and interesting question. So yeah, I would say digital spaces are, yeah, broadly speaking, environments created or mediated by digital technologies where people communicate, interact, share information, or organize, and they are crucial for any movement for human rights, peace building, and democracy, because digital spaces allow for the contestation of norms, for the shaping of ideas, and the organization of collective action. And digital spaces have also held the promise to radically change the ways of building collective identities, of mobilizing for political and social change, and for demanding accountability, because, yeah, they help to bypass traditional media and censorship. They help to document rights abuses and enable people to speak out even under repressive regimes or rigid social hierarchies. And we have seen in the past that digital platforms have facilitated the rapid organization of protest and the creation of decentralized, transnationally networked movements. And as we have seen in our research, the women activists and women human rights defenders we interviewed, yeah, exemplified the promises of these promises of digital space, because many lived in exile due to repression or conflict. Others advocated from the diaspora for political change in their origin countries. So we spoke, for instance, to a number of Iranian women journalists in exile who circumvent the regime's censorship to address audiences in their home countries. We spoke to Uyghur human rights defenders who work tirelessly to raise attention on the atrocities happening in their homeland. Or we spoke to Russian feminist activists who organize resistance against the war of aggression that Putin's government has launched against Ukraine. And all these activists rely on digital technologies to connect with and support people in their country of origin, in their home country, to raise awareness on rights violations and corruption, and to mobilize, yeah, international media and policymakers for their cause. And just because digital spaces are so essential for the work of these activists, they become also the target of authoritarian actors who aim to silence critical voices and forestall any challenges to their power and interests. And these very same tools are then used for surveillance, for censorship, for disinformation, and for abuse targeting these activists. And as we show in our research, and we will discuss today, women activists and women human rights defenders face particular gendered forms of online violence and digital threats that aim to push them out of these very same digital spaces. Yeah, I leave it at that, and let my colleagues continue. Thank you.
No, thank you. That's very helpful. I also just something that keeps hitting me as everybody is talking already is, we always say in our sector, and I say this a lot, when we know that defenders gather, or when women even gather, there's a power. And that power of mobilization, even having people able to communicate with each other, is such a threat to the status quo. And I guess what I'm envisioning now is, on the digital realm, that's exactly what's happening. There's a power to gather and connect, and that's a threat. So thank you, Marcus. Nuda, I'll pass it off to you. Can you give us a little sense of, what is the distinction between domestic and transnational repression? Can you define what digital transnational repression and gender-based political violence look like and how they're connected? And also maybe a little bit about authoritarianism and patriarchal structures and how these pave the way for this type of abuse, especially when we're talking about digital spaces where we have women human rights defenders. And finally, I'll ask you to conceptualize the repression in a feminist narrative or a feminist peace and security framework. Why do you think like this type of abuse exacerbates gender-based violence?
Thank you, Rouge. This is alone is a PhD thesis, I believe. I will try to be as as concise as I can. Thank you, everyone, for being here, taking time off your busy days to join us in this discussion. To start, I through the domestic digital repression, which is basically refers to when state or state-related actors using digital surveillance technology like censorship, surveillance, online harassment, disinformation, malware, and spyware, and the list is very long, unfortunately, to control, silence, intimidate critics and activists within their territorial borders. Whereas when it comes to digital transnational repression, it's when these same states use the same tools of digital repression domestically to reach and to target critics who are in exile and diaspora, and many of whom were subjected or will be subjected to the state violence in their home country, cross-border seeking refuge in other countries where they assume that they can enjoy some free spaces and they can continue their advocacy and work. And I need to mention as well that digital transnational repression is a subset of a broader and extended authoritarian practice called transnational repression, which is basically when these states extend their repression beyond their territorial borders to attack physically the activists and defenders on the territory of another country. As Marcus mentioned, almost a year ago, we published a huge report based on the experiences of 85 women and LGBTQ activists in exile who were subjected to different forms of digital transnational repression as well as transnational repression. And we described that digital gender-based digital transnational repression the tactics are political violence that weaponize gender and sexuality. Women, queer, non-binary, and gender diverse activists are attacked both for their political work and for their gender identities. These tactics, as Marcus mentioned, are sexualized and designed to shame or silence, including the tactics are very broad and diverse, unfortunately, but I can mention a few of them: fabricated rumors about morality, rape threats, and threats tied to patriarchal notions of honor. And to answer your question about how to frame it through a feminist peace and security lens, digital transnational repression, especially when gendered, should be understood as a form of structural and political violence that extend beyond the physical borders. It undermines human rights, silence marginalized identities, and reinforces the patriarchal norms and power dynamics globally. The gender dimensions reflects how patriarchal norms are mobilized to suppress not only dissidents, but also women and gender diverse people, agency in political sphere, and to send a message to other young women who are thinking of joining the movements that this is the consequence, and deter many of them from taking like bold steps in the advocacy. And many of them, like I talked to, they prefer to work from behind the scenes to avoid being targeted the same way. And many of them would mention the threats targeted at other women from their communities. And gender digital transnational repression intersects, in fact, with other axes of identity, such as race, ethnicity, migration status, socioeconomic class, which compounds the vulnerability of these targets. In our report, we noted that exiled women, human rights defenders, and peacemakers often lack robust social network support in their host countries, leaving them even more exposed and more vulnerable. In peace and security lens, I believe this phenomenon should be framed not only as a civil liberty issue, on attack on freedom of expression and privacy, but also as a gendered security issue, a threat to the bodily autonomy, dignity, mental health, social relation, and the capacity of women and LGBTQ activists to contribute to diasporic mobilization, advocacy, and peace building. Unfortunately, DTR provides new tools for authoritarian and patriarchal and misogynistic violence, like, for instance, as we documented, threats of sexual violence, defamation based on sexuality or moral characters, or even like false rumors, all of which exploit existing patriarchal and unleash the patriarchal expectations around gender and sexuality and honor. For exile defenders, these threats are deeply destabilizing because they come from powerful actors, which is particularly the state or its related actors, or proxy powers as well, which amplifies fear and silence dissidents. To make it to illustrate this case, let's imagine that an individual woman versus a powerful state or state leader. Even for local agencies in host states, like let's say Canada, for instance, or the US or UK, this might look as a legitimate attack. Without education, without advocacy, they might look at it as an attack, and which might lead into new forms of repression in and by the host state. We documented several cases. I'm happy to elaborate more and give concrete examples about real life women's experiences who were exposed to similar kinds of threats, both by the country of origin and consequently by the host state. Through our research, we find that these forms of gender digital violence often lead to significant harms. For instance, professional setbacks, social stigmatization, isolation, deterioration of intimate and family relationship, social withdrawal, emotional distress, physical and psychological harms as well. These are not random trolls or random attacks, but often coordinated campaigns by state and state-affiliated actors. The violence is unfortunately persist and targeted, amplifying the risk that survivors will self-censor, cease activism, and withdraw from public life and from the advocacy for human rights and peace more globally. I will stop here and pass it to my colleague.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's very telling that it can be so dangerous and the risks associated with it, and we'll get more into that as well. Sandra, can you expand a little bit on that? Actually, what are the specific, would you say, barriers and threats and risks facing women, especially including women human rights defenders and peace builders in these spaces? Can you explain a little bit about how women's experiences might differ than those of men, and how these experiences further are gendered and intersectional?
Thank you, and thanks for the introduction and moderating so far. So I think academic Sarah Sobiraj talks about aggressors online using 3 overlapping strategies to exclude women from online public places: intimidation, shame, and discrediting. And I think that really defines the experience of women online and elegantly summarizes what we have seen in our research and some of the tactics used to bar women from entering online public spaces. So some of the methods we have seen used against women online, both domestically and transnationally, include sending online threats, including rape threats and death threats, or threats to the target's family, trolling, where users post messages, images, videos, or otherwise online content, or create online campaigns such as using Twitter hashtags that target specific people, non-consensual distribution of intimate images, doxing, and the interception of private communication. So imagine contemplating being faced with all of this when you attempt to enter the online public space or being subject to this. Clearly, these are significant barriers. I think one thing I want to underline to add to what my colleagues have said is that the experience of women online and barriers to participation in digital spaces are exacerbated by what seems to be a rather complete institutional failure to protect and remedy the harms that come with the behavior and actions I've just described. So, in particular, the failure of law enforcement to adequately investigate, address, and protect online harm acts as a significant barrier to women's access to digital spaces. The first time you bring a situation they're experiencing to the police and they fail to react, this does not encourage you to continue engaging, right? It might just do just the opposite and make you realize that you're on your own. So the failure of states and society more generally to protect women, and in fact, the weaponization, as we've discussed, of digital spaces by some states to actually use this to actively harm and silence women is an evident barrier to women's participation in digital spaces. So our research that my colleagues have already mentioned, documenting the experiences of women targeted with acts of digital transnational oppression, we see that women human rights defenders in dissidents living in exile or in the diaspora, like so many other women, are regularly exposed to gendered online attacks and threats, including sexual slurs, harassment, vulgar comments on social media platforms, messages with detailed sexual fantasies, rape threats, and attacks related to targets' personal lives, which reflect these patriarchal ideas and attempt to deny women the ability to enter the online public space and to engage on political and social issues. And as Nora mentioned, the impacts of these attacks are significant barriers, right, to accessing digital spaces and engaging in transnational advocacy and political work. As women experience serious harms to their mental health, well-being, and social relations, they are left anxious about professional activities, the impacts of such attacks on their credibility and reputation, and they have to spend significant time just trying to navigate these spaces, these online spaces, by taking numerous steps to protect their digital security. Finally, I think it's necessary to underline that the harms faced by women, human rights defenders in exile in the diaspora, and we saw this in the research that we did, is significantly compounded by intersectional factors. So research already shows that women face greater and more severe online harms than men, as you know, several of us have discussed, which is then significantly compounded by their sometimes, if not often, precarious position living in exile or in the diaspora. For example, if their immigration status is not settled in the country in which they are living, and their status as human rights defenders, right? Being a human rights defender already makes you more likely to be vulnerable to digital targeting and to silencing in online public spaces. So I will leave it there, and hopefully we can discuss on a more positive note some of the steps that can be taken to address some of these issues.
Thank you, Santa. I think that's really enlightening. I have so many thoughts. And I like one thing that did stand out as all of you were speaking was the need for even just support after the fact. I know the first time I got attacked, I walked into a community meeting and I got surrounded by people that had experienced it. And just having that community to lean on after something like that happens, you don't realize the power in what that is and just even having each other. So thank you for that. So I guess on what you just ended with, I'll pass it off to the panel and I'll go back to you, Sienna. What do you think? What do we need to do to advocate for effective accountability and prevention measures? It seems, even the jurisdictional issue or law enforcement not understanding is a big piece of the puzzle. Who is responsible then, especially when it's maybe transnational, to prevent this gendered harm and abuse online? And what would you say is the role of host states and other institutions, and what institution for this even to be effective? How do we protect these folks?
So I'll try and maybe just offer a few thoughts on that and hand it over to Marcus. But I think what you just said there about community support is something that doesn't necessarily always get mentioned. And that's something we saw in our research, that when we brought together women who were targeted in this manner, they drew so much support and hope, I think, from seeing that other women had experienced something similar and were able to sort of share ideas about how to deal with it and to really understand the broader context and within which it's happening. So I think that's something really important to underline. I guess I'll put on my unfortunate lawyer hat and talk about sort of the legal framework more broadly. So states are, they have to prevent human rights abuses, right? Put quite simply, and remedy human rights abuses when they happen. So when we're thinking about this happening in transnational environment, host states really are responsible for preventing this from happening to women human rights defenders and other members of the civil society and the public who are engaging in transnational political advocacy work, right? So they are subject to these legal obligations. For example, Canada has ratified a number of regional and international human rights treaties, and they need to prevent these abuses from happening. So I think my colleagues will talk a bit more about what that looks like in practice. And then we also have the companies, right? Social media platforms. So a lot of this stuff is happening in the context of social media. And there is this broader sort of like soft law framework that companies have an obligation as well to prevent and remedy human rights abuses, right? So that's also important to underline. And while social media platforms have taken some steps, I mean, like we're seeing a big shift, I think, in how effective this is and how much they really intend to sort of implement, for example, their community policies and so on. And from what we've seen in our research, it's a complete failure. So, women will report to platforms, they get ignored. If even worse, they get the automated systems that are looking at what's happening online end up shutting down their accounts. The method for accessing someone at a company to be able to explain what's happening, to explain who you are, explain the risks you face don't exist, right? So you're just dealing with entering things into a form and hoping that someone's going to respond, and usually nobody does. So there's all these problems, and I promised I'd be more optimistic, and I'm not being more optimistic. So I'm handing it over to
Well, it's
Mark
practical.
Laura, who can
Please,
hopefully
Marcus, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'll hand it over, I think, to Marcus, who was going to build in a bit more detail regarding responses.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I'll take it directly. Yeah. Yeah, I would add a few words on first-hand support that is needed for targets. So because in mitigating the risks of digital transnational oppression and coping with the impacts of these attacks, targeted individuals and also communities are often left alone and to fend for themselves. And so, yeah, there's a need for coordinated support from civil society and also from governments in the countries of residence. So there's a need for technical and digital security assistance, so mechanisms of rapid response and direct technical advice to targets in case of digital security emergencies. People are often helpless or don't understand, uh, naturally don't understand, the technical backgrounds of the risks and attacks they're facing. There's also a need for legal counsel for activists who wish to seek a remedy or deal with any legal challenges that arise from digital attacks. Then even more so, or even vaster field is the need for psychological support, so specialized trauma-sensitive mental health support to address the emotional toll associated with digital threats, such as invasive surveillance, online harassment, or defamation. And as you pointed out, Ulrich, community support networks, support peer-to-peer support and solidarity for targets that help them to overcome these feelings of fear and isolation, because threat actors try to isolate people and intimidate them so that they stop speaking out. And all our respondents pointed out that these community support, solidarity, as you did, really helped them to overcome the impact of the attacks. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And I think that's a takeaway for the audience. Take note, when you see it happening, reach out. I've done it myself. I've made new friends by reaching out to defenders to just see if they're okay. And it's often very well received because they are very isolated. Thank you for that. Nuda, what would you say are important preventative, effective measures?
For sure, like I agree with everything that Sienna and Marcus mentioned. I believe stronger responses from the host states are very essential in this, sending very strong messages and acting from their own responsibility to protect people on their territory for sure. But to me, I think the missing point is the empowerment of community and targets resilience. Many people we talk to, they are not aware that DTR is something they need to report on. They especially in feminism and within the feminist communities, they would say, but I feel ashamed of reporting on this, whereas my sisters on the ground are being harassed and tortured and imprisoned or put under siege and in hunger. This is one of the things, the risk when you are in exile as activists working with vulnerable communities on the ground, your information and your online safety is not only your personal thing. It's about protecting the information, the very valuable information and communication with others. And I believe protecting the networks, whether in diaspora or even on the ground, is something very essential. So I always start from the need to raise the awareness of the communities and women and communities in particular, and empowering the resilience, not only in terms of giving them such few days digital security training, but how to make this digital security practices as a daily practice, understanding and here's also a message to donors and experts, how we need to understand where and how these activists in exile operate. They work in the same, many of them, they work in the same method of as grassroots activists and organizations on the ground. So we need to understand this. And last year, we published a nice white paper on how to make the digital security frameworks align with the needs and to meet the responsibility, the needs, for these grassroots organizations and activists. And for sure, when it comes to the work, daily reporting to the law enforcement and to the government agencies in the host country, there's a lot of missing aspects, including the awareness within the government's agencies as well, to start from there. But happy to continue this discussion in the Q&A.
No, thank you. I think it's so
Thanks.
important. And I think it's also so important to recognize people don't always know that they've become human rights defenders. Oftentimes it's circumstance, and we've been seeing it even here in Canada. I remember reaching out to someone once and saying, there is a community of support, even in the fact that we do this work together. So one, there needs to be more awareness, I think, on even understanding what it means when you're standing up, because people stand up because they're standing up for freedom or justice or whatever, and they become targets, but also then understanding that this is a human rights abuse, that there needs to be recourse, and we push, I think, on all angles. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're starting to get questions in the question section. Please, everyone, if you have anything, please start putting it in. We're keeping track, and we will get to a Q&A session towards the end of the panels. But what I'll do now is pivot to the next one, and we'll hear a little bit more about what's really been happening on the ground from our experts that are on today. This next panel is called Resistance, Resilience, and Advocacy. Unfortunately, one of our panelists is not able to be part of the conversation today, but I'm sure we're going to hear of her work, and we'll share a little bit more on that after the panel. But we can get started. So I'll start with who I see first on the screen, a quick intro. We have Natalia Arnault, and she is the president and founder of the Free Russia Foundation, a prominent fighter for the advancement of democracy, human rights, and freedom. From 2004 to 2014, Ms. Arnault worked for the International Republican Institute's IRI Russia office. For her work in support of human rights and civil society in Russia, in 2012, Ms. Arnault was given an ultimatum by Putin's security services to leave her homeland in 48 hours or face 20 years in prison on treason charges. Ms. Arnault resolved to continue her fight, and in 2014, she created the Free Russian Foundation to serve as a platform for pro-democracy Russians. FRF provides support to civil societies of Russia and Belarus and has programs to assist Ukraine. FRF is a powerful movement with centers in Washington, D.C. and Brussels, Kiev, Ukraine, Berlin, Germany, Vilnius, Lithuania, and Paris, France. Next, we have Shrestha Das. They are a queer disabled activist and work as a gender advisor and researcher at Amnesty International. At Amnesty, they developed the Make It Safe Online for Women, Girls, and LGBTI Peoples project, which looks at technology facilitated gender based violence through an intersectional and decolonial lens in different country contexts. Their work has largely been at the intersection of gender, sexuality, SRHR, militarization, and racial justice with various marginalized groups, using a structural and systemic analysis to holistically address social justice issues. So, with that, we'll get the panelists on. And I guess what I'll ask, I mean, there's so much to unpack in the work that you all do. I'll pass it off to Natalia first. Can you explain to us, and then I'll ask the same question to Shrestha. Can you explain to us a little bit about like your area of work in your experience and in the purview of the work? What are some examples of threats to feminist and peace movements, to human rights defenders that you say they face? And please also, if you can, expand a little bit, and even from your own experiences on, what is different when it's in their home country versus those in exile where possible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Rush, and thank you everybody for conducting this very important and very relevant webinar. I'm in this sphere of foreign assistance, democracy promotion, human rights promotion for 21 years. And 13 years of that I'm in exile. I had to flee from my home country. So I know what is repression, like from day one of my activism. When I was back in my home country in Russia, I knew that all my emails are being read by Russian security services, that all my phone calls are being recorded. I always had physical security details following me. I couldn't even normally go to any, I don't know, dinner with my family or friends or go to my gym. There would be always some KGB guy following me. When I had to flee Russia in December of 2012, because yes, it was probably one of the hardest decisions of my life. Easy one because I chose freedom. I didn't want to be in jail for 20 years for state treason, for working for an American democracy promotion organization, IRI. But it was, again, the hardest decision of my life. I was fleeing from my home country that I wanted to change from inside. Good realization when I fled was that activism doesn't end with borders and that I continue fighting for a free and democratic Russia from any location. My first country of exile was Lithuania, then Poland, then I moved to the United States and created Free Russia Foundation. But a bad realization was that the Kremlin has a very long and deep tentacles to the West, and they, because I thought I'm moving to a democratic world, I'm moving to a EU country, Lithuania first and Poland, and NATO country, and again, to a democracy from the dictatorship. And Russia is one of the top repressive countries in the world, one of the offenders in the in transnational repression. They export repression. They also trendsetter in all this repressive, in all the internal repression always lead to external aggression, and they bring everything what was against us inside the country. They bring all of that, the same toolkit, wherever we are, unfortunately. Of course, it was understandable that I was attacked online, but more and more it's like online and offline, it goes hand in hand, and it's like it's always together. I remember back in Russia to intimidate me very often those details, security details that were following me, they would tell me, we know what color is your underwear today. Again, just to intimidate, to silence me, to show that their recording devices, listening devices, they are not only just in those cafes where like in public spaces, but even in my home, in my apartment. But again, it's very unpleasant. But when you are committed, when you know what you're fighting for, it of course doesn't disengage you, doesn't change your position or your behavior. I mean, it changes your behavior because we understand that repression and transnational repression is a very permanent and persistent reality, and we have to filter all our work through this lens, unfortunately, through the lens of security, through the lens of how we or our team or our partners or our beneficiary, how we can be attacked. Of course, moving to the democratic world, it seemed like, okay, they can get us online, they can continue having all these online threats, they can use the repressive toolkits. For example, Free Russia Foundation is one of the very first undesirable organizations. And those activists who are inside Russia, they cannot freely, openly work with us. They can be in jail for that, just working with us. But moreover, last year we even were designated as an extremist and terrorist organization. And again, it's weaponization of repression. It's when after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, many activists would receive very obviously political sentences, like spreading the disinformation about the Russian army and their war crimes in Ukraine. It was very understandable for many Western governments, and they would give asylums or humanitarian visas easier. But when you are sentenced with extremism and terrorism, it's of course harder for all our teams and groups to be accommodated in their new communities. It's very important to recognize this problem. This is probably number one. It's not only that transnational repression is being done by authoritarian, totalitarian governments. Unfortunately, democracies very often enable that, and we should also understand that. It's very important to oppose it, because it's not only that we are, like those who are in diaspora, that we are targets. Like when there was a Skripal poisoning in London, a British lady died. So again, it's or 2 years ago, I was there was a huge surveillance about all my movements, and there was like, again, the Russian security services understood about my travel patterns, and I was poisoned in Europe, and I survived. But again, it was they used a spray, and it could anybody, like, okay, I can, like, it's possible that I don't drink or don't eat for some time, but it's impossible for me not to breathe. And the same for people around me. It's just very dangerous. So we should also understand that, yes, unfortunately, they're everywhere. It should be a whole of the government and whole of the society approach everywhere in all these host countries, but also a very coordinated response just of the democratic world. It's very important, because dictators, unfortunately, enforce each other, copy-paste each other's methods. We should be even more resilient to that, and even more unified. This is what they're trying to destroy all the time, like during the Soviet Union, under the communist regime, or during all these 25 long years of Putin's dictatorship. What the Russian regime is trying to do is atomize people, and any other authoritarian regime, it does the same, to atomize people, to destroy any collective action, any alliances, any coalitions. And I think we should be, solidarity should be our strongest weapon, and we should reinforce each other, teach each other. Like, again, everybody should know about all this, because they invent, their toolkit is always evolving. When something doesn't work, like Interpol red notices don't work that well any longer, they go in doing something else. They're using these bilateral treaties with countries, or again, using terrorism charges instead of like political charges, and many other things they do. Plus, of course, online technologies always, like, they develop and they improve. If before that it was very easy for us to figure out all this hacking, all this spam, phishing emails, that it was Russian security services, because English language wouldn't be that good. We would very easily identify that, oh, something is wrong with that or this email. Now, with the use of AI, they are completely, like, perfect. It's very, like, difficult to even to identify them. So we should be always, like, understanding how they evolve, and of course our resilience should be much bigger on that. So again, democracies won't defend themselves. We should defend democracies. Thank you.
That's very powerful. That's a very powerful note. I think it's very fascinating when you say, it's understandable that I would get attacked. And I think I would reframe that even to say that it's expected. We know that when we stand up, when you're actually being effective, there's an expectation that you're being attacked. And we learn, like you're saying, we only learn through experience what the tactics are and how to address them and how to be ready. So thank you for that.
Actually, exactly that. There was a very famous slain Russian opposition leader, Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated near the Kremlin many years ago. But he was saying, like, the biggest, like, the badge of honor or the biggest testimony to your effectiveness if the regime is irritated by your action and
Yes,
they attack
irritated.
you. Yes.
Yeah, 100%. And I've gotten that as well when we've had to have safety mechanisms in place, taking pictures of our family offline, changing, methods and timing and watching your back. It's definitely part of it. And I think that's universal. I know there's been questions in the chat to talk about, like, how are these support networks existing? I think they're very organic. And that's exactly what it is. We just recognize each other and we recognize and share our own protection tactics. And that's what we've just had to do. Thank you so much, Natalia. I know you'll get a lot of questions. There's a lot to unpack there, but I will pass it off to Shrestha. Can you tell us a little bit about what you work on, what you see, and the threats and examples that you see in terms of, attacks against movements and people?
Thanks, Aroj. So I'll come in more as somebody who has done a fair bit of research on this instead of the very rich experiences that Natalia spoke about directly experiencing this. But also as somebody who is currently in the diaspora, as an Indian diaspora in the UK, and has faced a lot of TFGBV for being critical of the Indian government, leading to actually removing myself from a lot of social media spaces. A lot of what was said does echo as well. Just briefly to go over the work that we've been doing at Amnesty around this. To start off, last year we launched the global campaign called Make It Safe Online for women, girls, and LGBTI people, which has really sought to highlight how patterns of threats, what the kind of patterns of threats are that marginalized women, girls, and LGBTI people are facing in defending online civic spaces and the impact on their human rights as a result. We've used really a participatory, intersectional, and a decolonial feminist lens, and used 3 case studies to highlight what the lived realities look like for people facing intersectional discrimination in Thailand, Uganda, and Canada. So last year the first report we launched was in Thailand, where we looked at how women and LGBTI activists, particularly those engaged in pro-democracy protests, how they were targeted through digital surveillance, especially through the use of Pegasus, but also through the use of online harassment and smear campaigns, some of the tactics which echo what previous panelists in the earlier session were talking about as well. In Uganda, we specifically, the report is also out there. We specifically looked at the effect of criminalization laws, especially the Anti-Homosexuality Act, on LGBTI people, especially those who are also socioeconomically marginalized, and noted how criminalization kind of also subjects them to heightened forms of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, while also making any kind of access to justice completely impossible. We have an upcoming report, a 3rd case study focusing on Canada, where we are looking at the TFGBV that's faced by women and 2S LGBTQI people from Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. And we have a shorter briefing coming out early next year, which is specifically looking at xenophobic forms of TFGBV, something that we are seeing increasingly across all contexts, not just in Canada. In addition, Amnesty has done similar work to look at TFGBV in the context of Poland, where we have specifically looked at LGBTI activists. And in terms of women human rights defenders, we have also looked at Yemen, Tunisia, and I'm going to be sharing a bit more about some of the common patterns of TFGBV or technology-facilitated gender-based violence that we have observed in these different contexts. Amnesty has also looked at the role of platforms and how their business models and their algorithms prioritize as well as amplify some of the most harmful content, including advocacy of hatred, misinformation, and content inciting racial violence against various groups in the context of armed conflicts and genocides, such as in the case of Myanmar and Ethiopia. And especially in this context where we're talking about the WPS agenda, it is equally important to understand that all of these forms of amplifications and algorithms of really harmful content equally hinders the ability of women human rights defenders, peace activists to amplify their message, and also subjects them to higher forms of violence and discrimination as well. So going back to the kind of patterns that we've seen in TFGBV that human rights defenders and activists are being subjected to, some of the key forms that we've noted, a lot of which echoes what previous panelists have talked about, is of course doxing, especially for women human rights defenders. It can, as Noura was mentioning earlier, it can be a lot of information that is intended to sexually shame them as well, along with revealing their personal address, their real name, or in the case of LGBTI people, their dead name, the names of their children, their phone numbers or email addresses. Then there are threats of violence, both direct and indirect. Obviously, there are physical threats, but in gendered forms of TFGBV, of course, there are a lot of rape threats and sexualized threats as well. And we have often seen this spill over to the offline world as well. Then there is video and image-based abuse, where non-consensual images are shared or threatened to be shared in online spaces, and often used as a blackmailing tactic to get the person who is being targeted to carry out whatever the blackmailer wants them to do, which can be to continue sharing more sexualized images. It can be for money, it can be for a range of different tactics. We've seen, especially with AI, the rise of deepfakes, morphed images, especially that can depict survivors in like sexually explicit manner. We've also seen people send unsolicited sexual images or messages to another person as well. One of the two key forms of TFGBV that we've noted are online harassment, cyberbullying, which is basically to threaten and target women, girls, and LGBTI people through abusive comments or images in a very coordinated fashion. And of course, we've seen that there's an intersectional angle to this. So if there is race or queer identity or ethnicity, disability, caste, all of these, religion, all of these are intermeshed in the kind of targeting and harassment that people face. And the multiple intersecting identities all of their identities are used against them. Then there is also hateful and abusive speech, where people use really derogatory and offensive language based on somebody's gender, their sexual orientation, gender expression, which is intended to dehumanize them and also simultaneously encourage violence against women, girls, and LGBTI people. Another form is outing. This is specifically in the context of LGBTI people, where a person's sexual orientation or their gender identity is disclosed without their consent, and it's a clear violation of their right to privacy. Like I said, we've also seen digital blackmailing, either through threats of sharing non-consensual images or hacking into people's devices and using that against them. And the last form, as we had mentioned at Amnesty, we've classified targeted surveillance that specifically seeks to target a person or an organization through spyware or through access and monitoring of their activities and private data, also as a form of TFGBV, because women and LGBTI people often have to pay a higher price when their privacy is breached, or the ways in which their private data can be weaponized against them directly makes it a form of TFGBV. Going back to the second part of your question of how these can play out differently, a lot of these can be quite common across transnational repression and what can happen within geographical territories and boundaries. But what we do see is that specifically in the context of transnational repression or diaspora being targeted, there is use of sexual or cultural norms and mores that are more relevant to the home country being used to target somebody who is in the diaspora, which might not be something that's relevant to the diaspora. We've seen threats to their family for a lot of people who are either in exile or living in another country as a migrant, refugee, or asylum seeker. A lot of their family is back home. So it's not just about like And there should have been a trigger warning earlier from my side as well. But the rape threats are not just limited to them, it's also then passes on to other female family members as well. So there is a threat of like, we will harm your family or you will be arrested when you step foot here. So there's a lot of fear of what their families will go through as well.
Well, thank you, Shresha. It's a very comprehensive list, and I can only imagine that it's not a complete list. The research continues, and I know we're getting questions about research as well. I don't think the research is as advanced on this. It's very difficult to be able to document everything because, one, people don't even know sometimes there's actual abuse. A lot of people are, isolated, and at the same time, like, where and how are people going to be reporting this to one body? So it's very important as we even get stats for the audience to acknowledge and recognize that, there isn't necessarily extensive research on this, but at the same time, what we're hearing right now, I mean, should be disturbing enough, and the realities of how widespread this is. We hear that it's across borders, it's across contexts, it's across countries. I live in Canada. We are seeing the doxing, the harassment, the following happening here, and death threats. It's not limited to just certain contexts. So thank you so much. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get the audience to go ahead. We're going to have a little bit of a Q&A session in a few minutes. But please, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put in to the Q&A your question. And in the meantime, what we're going to start to do is a little poll in the audience. So what you'll see on your screen now is a QR code. So please go ahead and scan it. Or go to slido.com and enter the following code. So it's 1391795. You should see it on your screen. And the question that we're asking you is, what do you believe is the biggest digital threat to women, human rights defenders, and peace builders today? I guess there's a lot to process in the conversations we've just had, but please go ahead and do that. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, please put them into the chat and we can start answering. So we'll give everybody a minute or two to do that. And then just, I guess, to our tech geniuses, are we going to see the results on the screen? Okay, perfect. And I guess while we're doing that, I can ask a question, we can have a discussion. So I think going back to Shrestha and Natalia, this is something that I've been really thinking about, but how have you seen surveillance and abuse, repression, and even discrediting tactics happen within communities?
Yeah, that's sorry, Natalia, do you want to go ahead?
I'll go ahead.
Go ahead, Natalia. Shasta, go ahead.
Yeah, I think community itself is a broad term, right? Like it can mean communities in various ways, and our different identities put us in different kinds of communities as well. But this has been a difficult context where, for example, in the context of Canada, where we've been researching the kind of hate that like racist hate that Black, Indigenous, and racialized groups face, we've also noticed that there is a lot of intra-group targeting of women as well, especially if they're engaged in speaking out against some of the cultural norms and mores that are there. So that's definitely a pattern that we've seen, that there is intra-cultural shutting down, and it's not to say that one has just one identity, right? If you're queer, you're targeted. If you're a woman, you're targeted. I'm Indian, so for example, if you're speaking out about Kashmir, or if you're Muslim, you're targeted. So anything could lead to targeting, like difference of political opinions could lead you to being targeted. So there are different ways in which people get targeted, and what becomes particularly relevant for diaspora communities, one of the key things that we've noted is that if the underlying conditions of safety don't exist for diaspora communities because of racialized systems, for instance, it makes it that much more harder to speak out. So, for example, if I'm living under an overall threat of or overall culture where immigrants are demonized or Black and brown people are subjected to racist stereotypes and hate, it becomes that much more difficult for me to speak out about violence within my own community, because then it adds to the stereotypes that are already targeting my community. So I would say that exists, but to be able to address that, there has to be some amount of safety and underlying security that women and LGBTI defenders in particular can feel, and targeting broader systems of racism and different kinds of structural discrimination as well, through to which people are targeted, so that they can feel like they can speak out without threat of security or threat of reinforcing stereotypes against the community. And the last thing I would say is, as Noura said, like there's a lot of like lack of support system as well, which can also further suppress people speaking out if there is TFGBV within communities as well. Especially if you're in diaspora communities or in exile communities already much smaller. So without having proper support system or the state doing something or creating that kind of a support system for you, it can become that much more difficult, which again makes it imperative that we find ways to support each other.
Yeah, that's something that we're hearing recurring through this conversation, is that the support systems are huge and critical. Natalia, what would you say have you seen in terms of, surveillance, abuse, even discrediting tactics within the community itself? Again, defining community broadly.
Well, the Kremlin was very smart in the way that they, again, their propaganda campaigns are huge, their malign activities abroad are huge, and of course, those who are in exile, those who are in diaspora, they targeted that a lot, and many of them are also zombified the same way with the Kremlin's narratives, propaganda, as many people inside the country. Plus, of course, infiltration is huge, so they understand how to divide and conquer. And when there was a very big narrative after the full-scale invasion, a very understandable one, that it's a collective guilt of all Russians, and many Russians, those who were pro-democracy, anti-war, didn't find support in the democratic world. And of course, the Kremlin immediately was using it as like, see, only we defend you, they are against you only because you're Russian. So they do that a lot. Several years ago, my organization found KGB manuals that was trained in Soviet KGB schools in the 60s and 70s. We translated methods are still the same. Of course, now there are like better digital tools, technical solutions and all that, but the tools are the same: how to manipulate public opinion, how to instill fear, how to recruit foreigners and things like that. It's absolutely same. And I was very surprised to see that. And then I understood it's a huge psychological warfare. People are people. 1,000 years ago, now in 100 years, we will be different. Some will be greedy, some will be envious, some will be not courageous, somebody will be very brave, and they know how to use it. And unfortunately, what we see, it's very important. And when our response is very often slow, mute, and worse, non-existent, I think it's very bad for all of us. So this is, again, that's why I've always saying that we should inform each other, we should show what are the latest trends, what are the latest tools in the huge playbook, how they again take us, target us, what can be done. I think it's very important. This what dictators fear mostly. It's our collective action, it's our solidarity, it's our alliances. I think this is the
100%.
weapon.
It's the gathering. And I think when you can infiltrate the movements, which does happen, I can tell you in my movements, I'm always checking to see who's sitting beside me. There's a definite element of mistrust, but that's founded, is something also to acknowledge. And make sure that we're aware of, but it's just something it's something else that comes from experience and recognizing the reality, the extent of our work and what it really means and how much they're threatened. So thank you for that. I think it's very enlightening to hear, and I know we can all talk for hours and hours on this, but thank you for those that contributed to the poll. I think there will be a recording of the webinar, so you'll be able to see. I saw a lot of what was said, the doxing, the hate speech, all of that pop up. Appreciate it, everybody. So what I'm going to do now is just quickly sum up. I know today we heard, that digital repression, violence can online is gendered for sure, that the intersectional nature of identities, that they're really targeted and manipulated for abuse. We heard that there is a need for community solidarity, and we heard that there needs to be a lot more active accountability from those that are actually designated to uphold human rights. So whether that's state obligations, and we heard from Sienna talking about how even companies need to be more accountable because they are the ones hosting the social media platforms. We've heard, I don't even know what the right word is in terms of if it's tragic or disturbing, or for me, it's enraging, the types of abuse that we go through in the work that we do. But I think the light on that, and it was mentioned, was the fact that we know we're being affected when we're effective when those attacks happen, and the fact that you can stand up, and when you stand up that you will and might get targeted means your voice has resonance. And I hope that for those that are listening, always wondering if they need to just do a little bit more, but are unsure if they should, I hope that that resonates, that if the more of us stand up together, there's solidarity and power in that. And so I think that's a very important piece to acknowledge, that we need to make sure that we protect each other and that we protect our causes, and do so with all the multi sort of approaches that we need to adopt. We heard about abuses such as doxing, sexualized hate. We know that it can go from the digital realm into reality. It's literally a life and death situation to ask for freedoms and justice in many contexts across borders. And so I appreciate each and every one of you and the work that you're doing. I know that it's a community of practice, it's a community of solidarity, and that's exactly what it needs to be. So with that, I think we're on time, and we can close off. I think, I don't know if folks want to get in touch with Citizen Lab to get any follow-up. I know there's a lot of reports and products that were mentioned today as we were speaking, and I hope that those could be shared, I think, with the audience as well. I know we were keeping track of what those were. And I thank everyone for their time. I think this is an important conversation and it needs to move beyond discussion. So I will give homework to the audience to go back and reflect maybe on one or two things that you can do after listening to this conversation today. And please spread the word, spread the message, and let's get our world in a better place. I'll leave it at that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.